Consider this scenario. You encounter someone whose appearance immediately triggers a negative judgment. Within seconds, your mind has constructed an entire narrative about their character, abilities, and worth. But what if I told you that this very moment, this automatic response, represents one of the most profound philosophical problems of human existence? During my years developing the critical system in Königsberg, I discovered that the greatest obstacle to genuine knowledge and moral action is not external ignorance, but the internal prejudices that corrupt our reasoning before we even begin to think. The human mind, I came to understand, is not a passive mirror reflecting reality, but an active constructor that often builds elaborate edifices of belief upon foundations of sand. Today, we'll explore how the critical method I developed specifically targets what you now call cognitive bias, those systematic errors in thinking that lead us away from truth and justice. More importantly, you'll discover practical techniques for applying transcendental philosophy to purify your reasoning and achieve genuine moral clarity. The stakes could not be higher. In a world where prejudice masquerades as wisdom and bias presents itself as insight, only rigorous critical thinking can guide us toward authentic knowledge and ethical action. Are you ready to examine the very foundations of how you think? Chapter 1: The Critical Revolution: Understanding the Mind's Construction of Reality. The fundamental insight that revolutionized my entire philosophical enterprise was this startling recognition: the mind does not simply receive impressions from the world, but actively shapes and organizes every experience according to its own inherent structures. This discovery, which I called the Copernican Revolution in philosophy, reveals why cognitive bias is not merely an occasional error, but an inevitable consequence of how human consciousness operates. Consider how you experience space and time. You never encounter an object that exists outside of spatial and temporal relations. Everything you perceive is here or there, before or after. But through rigorous analysis, I discovered that space and time are not features of things in themselves, but forms of human intuition, the very conditions that make experience possible. This means your mind is constantly imposing organizational structures upon the raw data of sensation. The same principle applies to the categories of understanding, concepts like causality, unity, and plurality that your mind automatically uses to synthesize the manifold of sensation into coherent experience. When you see one event following another and judge that the first caused the second, you're not simply reading causality off the surface of phenomena. You're applying a mental category that exists a priori, before any particular experience. This revelation has profound implications for understanding bias. What you call confirmation bias, the tendency to interpret information in ways that confirm pre-existing beliefs, is actually a manifestation of how the mind necessarily constructs experience through predetermined categories. Your consciousness cannot help but organize incoming data according to existing conceptual frameworks. But here lies both the problem and the solution. While we cannot escape the mind's constructive activity, we can become critically aware of it. The transcendental method teaches us to examine not just what we think, but how we think, to investigate the very conditions that make thinking possible. By understanding the mind's active role in constructing experience, we gain the power to regulate and purify our cognitive processes. This is why mere accumulation of information never eliminates bias. Without critical self-examination of the thinking process itself, additional data simply provides more material for the mind to organize according to its existing prejudicial patterns. True intellectual liberation requires a transcendental investigation into the very foundations of human reason. Chapter 2: The Universalization Test: Exposing Bias Through Rational Consistency. The categorical imperative provides the most powerful tool ever devised for detecting and eliminating cognitive bias. Its first formulation, act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law, functions as a rigorous test that exposes the hidden inconsistencies and special pleading that characterize biased thinking. Consider how this works in practice. When you find yourself making an exception for your own behavior while maintaining different standards for others, you're engaging in what philosophers now call attribution bias. The universalization test immediately reveals this inconsistency. Ask yourself, can I rationally will that everyone in similar circumstances act according to the same principle I'm applying to myself? Take a common example, justifying a lie by claiming special circumstances. When subjected to the universalization test, this justification collapses. You cannot rationally will that everyone lie whenever they judge their circumstances to be special, because this would eliminate the very possibility of truthful communication that makes lying effective. The bias reveals itself through its inherent irrationality. The beauty of this method lies in its formal character. Unlike approaches that rely on particular moral intuitions or cultural norms, the universalization test operates through pure logical analysis. It doesn't matter what your personal preferences are, what your society teaches, or what consequences you desire. The question is simply whether your proposed maxim can pass the test of rational consistency when universalized. This same technique exposes racial, gender, and class prejudices with devastating clarity. Any principle that grants special consideration based on morally irrelevant characteristics fails the universalization test. You cannot rationally will that everyone receive different treatment based on race, because race has no logical connection to moral worth or rational capacity. But the categorical imperative goes deeper than exposing obvious prejudices. It reveals the subtle ways bias corrupts even well-intentioned reasoning. When you support a policy that benefits your group while claiming to act from universal principles, the universalization test asks whether you would support the same policy if it benefited different groups. This exposes the hidden self-interest that often masquerades as moral reasoning. The key insight is that genuine moral principles must be rationally universalizable precisely because moral reasoning transcends the particularity of individual perspective. Bias always involves treating your own case as special in ways that cannot be rationally justified. The categorical imperative eliminates this possibility by requiring that all moral maxims pass the test of universal rational acceptability. Chapter 3: Human Dignity and the Elimination of Prejudice. The second formulation of the categorical imperative, act so that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of another, always as an end and never merely as a means, provides the philosophical foundation for understanding why all forms of prejudice and discrimination represent fundamental violations of human dignity. Every instance of bias involves reducing another person to a collection of superficial characteristics rather than recognizing their inherent worth as a rational being. When you judge someone based on their race, gender, religion, or social class, you're treating them merely as a means to satisfy your psychological need for categorization and group identification. You're failing to acknowledge what makes them fundamentally human, their capacity for rational autonomy. Consider how this works in what contemporary psychology calls implicit bias. Even when you consciously reject prejudicial attitudes, unconscious associations may still influence your behavior. From a Kantian perspective, these unconscious responses reflect a failure to consistently apply the principle of human dignity. The automatic categorization of people based on external characteristics represents a systematic refusal to engage with their rational personhood. But here's the crucial insight: overcoming bias isn't simply a matter of emotional training or cultural conditioning. It requires a fundamental shift in how you conceive of human beings. When you truly understand that every person possesses the same rational capacity that makes moral agency possible, you cannot consistently treat them as mere objects of your psychological projections. This is why superficial approaches to bias reduction often fail. Sensitivity training that focuses only on changing behavior without addressing underlying philosophical assumptions leaves the deeper problem untouched. Unless you recognize the absolute value of rational personhood, you'll continue to slip into patterns of treating others instrumentally. The dignity principle also reveals why good intentions aren't enough to eliminate bias. Even when you sincerely desire to treat others fairly, residual prejudices may still influence your actions if you haven't fully internalized the philosophical truth of universal human dignity. This is why the categorical imperative requires not just good outcomes, but goodwill, a fundamental commitment to respecting humanity as an end in itself. I invite you to examine your own interactions today. How often do you find yourself making snap judgments about people based on appearance, accent, or social position? Each of these moments represents an opportunity to apply the dignity principle actively. Instead of allowing automatic categorization to proceed unchecked, pause and consciously acknowledge the rational personhood of the individual before you. This practice transforms everyday encounters into exercises in moral development. Every interaction becomes an opportunity to honor human dignity by treating the other person as a full rational agent rather than a representative of some category. Over time, this conscious application of the dignity principle can fundamentally alter your patterns of perception and response. The goal isn't to eliminate all mental categorization, this is psychologically impossible, but to ensure that your ultimate recognition of others is grounded in their shared rational humanity rather than superficial differences. When this recognition becomes habitual, bias loses its grip on your moral reasoning. Chapter 4: Goodwill versus Biased Motivation, the Purity of Moral Intention. The analysis of goodwill that opens my groundwork for the metaphysics of morals provides essential insight into how bias corrupts moral motivation at its source. Goodwill, I argued, is the only thing that is unconditionally good precisely because it operates independently of all external influences, including the psychological prejudices that typically drive human behavior. Most people believe they act from good intentions while remaining unaware of how bias shapes their underlying motivations. Consider someone who claims to support colorblind policies while unconsciously favoring approaches that maintain existing racial hierarchies. Their conscious intention may be genuinely egalitarian, but their deeper motivation remains corrupted by unexamined prejudice. The crucial distinction here is between acting according to duty and acting from duty. You might perform the correct action, treating people equally, speaking respectfully, supporting fair policies, while your underlying motivation remains tainted by bias. Perhaps you avoid discriminatory behavior because you fear social consequences, or because discrimination conflicts with your self-image as a good person. These motivations, while producing beneficial outcomes, do not constitute genuine moral action. Acting from duty requires that your actions stem from pure respect for the moral law itself, independent of all empirical influences including psychological preferences, social pressures, and unconscious biases. This seems impossibly demanding, but it reveals why overcoming bias requires more than behavioral modification. It demands fundamental purification of moral motivation. The test of genuine goodwill is whether you would maintain your commitment to equal treatment and human dignity even if doing so contradicted all your natural inclinations, social conditioning, and psychological comfort. Would you defend the rights of those you instinctively dislike? Would you acknowledge the full humanity of those whose presence makes you uncomfortable? Would you support just policies that disadvantage groups you identify with? This analysis reveals why bias is not merely an intellectual error, but a form of moral corruption. When prejudice influences your actions, you're no longer acting from pure respect for humanity, but from a complex mixture of rational principle and irrational preference. Your will becomes heteronomous, determined by forces outside the autonomous moral law. But recognizing this problem points toward its solution. By constantly examining your motivations for traces of bias, you can gradually purify your moral intentions. The goal is not to eliminate all natural preferences, this is neither possible nor necessary, but to ensure that these preferences never override your fundamental commitment to treating all rational beings with equal dignity. This requires what I call moral asceticism, a disciplined practice of acting from duty even when duty conflicts with inclination. Each time you choose to override a biased impulse out of pure respect for moral law, you strengthen your capacity for genuine moral action. Over time, this practice can transform your character so that unbiased treatment becomes not just your policy, but your deepest motivation. The ultimate test is whether your commitment to human equality stems from philosophical conviction about rational dignity, or from psychological preferences that could change under different circumstances. Chapter 5: Freedom, Determinism, and Moral Responsibility, Escaping the Causal Chain of Bias. One of the most sophisticated challenges to moral responsibility comes from recognizing how deeply our thinking is shaped by factors beyond our control. If cognitive biases result from evolutionary programming, social conditioning, and unconscious psychological processes, can we truly be held responsible for biased thoughts and actions? This question strikes at the heart of what I called the third antinomy, the apparent conflict between natural determinism and moral freedom. In the phenomenal realm, the world as it appears to us through sensible experience, everything occurs according to strict causal laws. Your brain processes, social influences, evolutionary heritage, and psychological conditioning all operate through natural mechanisms that seem to leave no room for genuine choice. From this perspective, cognitive bias appears to be simply another natural phenomenon, no more subject to moral evaluation than gravity or photosynthesis. But this deterministic picture only captures one aspect of human existence. As rational beings, you also belong to what I call the intelligible realm, the sphere of freedom where the moral law makes authentic choice possible. This is not a mystical claim, but a practical necessity revealed through moral experience itself. The very fact that you can recognize bias as bias, and feel obligated to overcome it, demonstrates a capacity that transcends mere natural causation. The key insight is that moral freedom doesn't require exemption from all causal influence, but rather the capacity to act according to rationally chosen principles rather than being merely driven by empirical impulses. When you recognize a biased thought and choose to reject it based on rational moral analysis, you're exercising genuine freedom even though the initial biased response was causally determined. This understanding transforms how we approach bias reduction. Instead of seeing prejudice as an immutable fact about human psychology, we can recognize it as a natural tendency that rational agents have the capacity and obligation to regulate. You cannot control the initial appearance of biased thoughts, but you can take responsibility for how you respond to them. Consider implicit bias again from this perspective. The automatic associations your brain makes based on past conditioning operate through natural psychological mechanisms. But your ability to recognize these associations as problematic, subject them to rational critique, and choose different response patterns demonstrates moral freedom in action. You're not responsible for having unconscious biases, but you are responsible for what you do once you become aware of them. This analysis also reveals why moral education must go beyond simply providing information about the harmful effects of bias. Facts alone cannot motivate behavioral change because they remain within the realm of natural causation. Genuine transformation requires appealing to the rational capacity that enables autonomous moral action, what I called the fact of reason, that makes us capable of acting from duty rather than mere inclination. I invite you to reflect on moments when you've successfully overcome biased impulses. What made this possible? Not simply recognizing that bias is wrong in some abstract sense, but acknowledging your rational capacity to choose principles that transcend your immediate psychological reactions. This capacity for moral self-determination is what makes you more than merely a sophisticated animal. It's what makes you a moral agent worthy of dignity and capable of respecting the dignity of others. The practical implication is that overcoming bias requires cultivating this rational capacity through disciplined moral reflection and practice. Each time you choose principle over prejudice, you strengthen your moral freedom and move closer to genuine autonomy. Chapter 6: The Regulative Ideal, Rational Hope in the Struggle Against Prejudice. The complete elimination of cognitive bias may be impossible for finite rational beings like ourselves, but this practical limitation does not diminish our moral obligation to strive continually toward this ideal. In my analysis of practical reason's postulates, I demonstrated how rational hope guides moral action even when complete success lies beyond empirical possibility. The highest good, what I called the summum bonum, requires the perfect harmony of virtue and happiness, moral worth and empirical satisfaction. In the context of bias elimination, this translates to a world where rational principles of human dignity and universal justice are perfectly realized in both individual consciousness and social institutions. While we cannot prove that such a world is possible, practical reason demands that we act as if it were achievable. This regulative ideal of bias-free reasoning serves multiple crucial functions. First, it provides a standard against which to measure progress. Without an absolute ideal of rational impartiality, we might mistake incremental improvements for ultimate success, becoming complacent about remaining prejudices. The ideal keeps us humble and motivated for continued growth. Second, the ideal enables rational hope in the face of seemingly intractable problems. When confronting deep-seated prejudices that have persisted across centuries and cultures, it's easy to despair about the possibility of genuine progress. But reason demands that we maintain hope for ultimate success, not because experience guarantees it, but because moral action requires it. Consider how this applies to systemic racism, gender discrimination, or religious prejudice. These problems appear so deeply embedded in human psychology and social structures that complete elimination seems impossible. Yet the categorical imperative requires that we continue working toward universal recognition of human dignity, regardless of empirical obstacles. The regulative ideal also guides how we evaluate partial progress. Each individual who overcomes a personal bias, each institution that implements more equitable policies, each generation that grows more inclusive than the last, these represent genuine moral advances that participate in the movement toward the ideal. They have value not just for their immediate effects, but as steps toward ultimate rational community. But this hope must remain rational rather than merely sentimental. It cannot be based on naive optimism about human nature or historical inevitability. Instead, it rests on the practical necessity that moral agents must be able to envision the complete realization of moral principles. Without this possibility, moral action would be literally meaningless. This perspective transforms how we approach setbacks in the struggle against bias. When prejudice reasserts itself in new forms, when progress seems to stagnate or even reverse, we need not despair because our ultimate standard is not empirical success but rational duty. We act from respect for moral law, not from confidence about outcomes. The practical implication is that each person must take responsibility for whatever progress is possible within their sphere of influence, while maintaining rational hope for ultimate success beyond what any individual can achieve. You cannot eliminate all bias from human consciousness, but you can purify your own thinking and contribute to institutions that embody rational principles more fully. This requires what I called moral patience, the capacity to work persistently toward ideals that may not be realized within your lifetime, sustained by rational conviction rather than empirical evidence of inevitable success. Chapter 7: Practical Applications, Kantian Techniques for Modern Bias Reduction. The principles we've explored translate into concrete practices that Americans can implement immediately to reduce cognitive bias and prejudice in personal and professional contexts. These techniques go beyond surface-level diversity training to address the philosophical foundations of biased thinking. In workplace settings, apply the universalization test to hiring and promotion decisions. Before making any personnel choice, ask, could I rationally will that all managers use the same criteria I'm applying here? This immediately exposes preferences based on personal comfort, cultural similarity, or unconscious stereotypes. If you wouldn't want your criteria universally applied, they likely reflect bias rather than legitimate job-related factors. For media consumption and news evaluation, employ the critical method by examining not just what information you're receiving, but how your mind processes it. Notice when articles or reports confirm your existing beliefs versus challenge them. The critical approach demands that you actively seek out perspectives that make you uncomfortable, not because discomfort indicates truth, but because comfort often signals bias confirmation. In social interactions, practice the dignity principle by consciously acknowledging the rational personhood of everyone you encounter, especially those who trigger automatic negative responses. This isn't about forced positivity or denying real differences, but about recognizing the fundamental capacity for moral agency that every person possesses regardless of their appearance, background, or behavior. When making political judgments, separate your evaluation of policies from your feelings about the groups they benefit or harm. Ask whether you would support the same principle if it were applied to benefit different constituencies. This exposes the tribal thinking that often masquerades as principled political reasoning. True moral consistency requires supporting just principles regardless of their immediate effects on your preferred groups. For criminal justice and legal contexts, apply the humanity formula by asking whether current practices treat defendants, victims, and communities as ends in themselves rather than mere means to various social goals. This perspective reveals how both punitive and rehabilitative approaches can violate human dignity when they reduce persons to their criminal acts or social utility. In educational settings, the categorical imperative demands that we provide equal educational opportunities not because of expected outcomes, but because rational beings deserve access to the tools for developing their rational capacities. This principle cuts through debates about group differences to focus on what every person deserves simply by virtue of their humanity. Technology and social media present new challenges that require updated applications of eternal principles. The design of algorithms and platforms should pass the universalization test. Could we rationally will that all information systems operate according to the same principles? The dignity principle demands that users be treated as autonomous agents capable of rational choice rather than mere objects of manipulation and data extraction. Healthcare decisions, both personal and policy-related, must honor human dignity by ensuring that treatment differences reflect medically relevant factors rather than social prejudices. The universalization test exposes when standard of care actually represents systematic bias against particular populations. The most powerful daily practice is what I call transcendental reflection, regularly examining not just what you think, but how you think. Set aside time each day to analyze your automatic responses, emotional reactions, and snap judgments. Ask what assumptions underlie these responses and whether they would pass rational scrutiny. Remember that this is not about achieving perfect rationality, this is impossible for finite beings, but about taking responsibility for the rational capacities you do possess. Each moment of conscious bias recognition and correction strengthens your moral agency and contributes to the broader project of human dignity. Conclusion. The critical method I developed in Königsberg offers more than historical philosophical insight, it provides practical tools for the most urgent challenge facing rational beings in every age, overcoming the prejudices that corrupt both knowledge and morality. Through rigorous application of the universalization test, unwavering commitment to human dignity, and honest examination of our own motivations, we can gradually purify our reasoning and approach the regulative ideal of impartial justice. But this enterprise requires more than intellectual understanding. It demands what I called moral courage, the willingness to subject your most comfortable beliefs to rational scrutiny and act according to principle even when principle conflicts with inclination. The stakes extend far beyond personal improvement to encompass the possibility of rational community itself. Every time you choose to override a biased impulse, question an automatic assumption, or treat another person with dignity that transcends their category memberships, you participate in humanity's ongoing project of moral development. This is not utopian dreaming but practical necessity, for without the regulative ideal of bias-free reasoning, moral action becomes literally meaningless. Begin today with this commitment, to examine one automatic judgment, test one comfortable belief, and recognize the full humanity of one person who makes you uncomfortable. These small acts of rational discipline, repeated consistently, can transform both your character and your contribution to the moral progress of humankind. Remember, you possess the same rational capacity that makes moral autonomy possible. The question is whether you will choose to exercise it.